Hello and welcome to the Marketing Times Analytics podcast. I'm your host, Alex Sofronas, and today we're on with Barbara Galiza. Barbara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me, Alex. My name is Barbara. I'm a growth and marketing analytics freelancer, and I also write a newsletter about the intersection of marketing and data. That's 0 to 1 newsletter.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we're both in the growth marketing space. I'm excited to learn about what you're working on and the value that you bring to your clients, maybe the specific areas that you're focused on. But could you give us just an overview of what growth marketing is for a business?
Wow, yeah, that's a great and broad question. Plenty of people would describe growth marketing in different ways. I would say it's an intersection between all the different parts of the business that can lead to revenue growth. So that's product, data, marketing, engineering, all coming together, trying to find levers and opportunities to improve the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you work both in growth marketing and in data analytics? Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Usually, I would say that growth marketers tend to be T-shaped. There is the T-shaped growth marketer idea, and I would say T in specific is data. So usually, the most useful when companies are trying to either collect data, analyze data, or make decisions from data.
Mm-hmm. Is there a particular kind of data that you analyze most often to gain insights for where you can make growth marketing optimizations from?
Yeah, I would say that the most common type of data that I analyze nowadays would be paid media. The nature of paid media generates a lot of data, especially if you're a bigger advertiser, like doing things like multiple channels. You have multiple tools that you're tracking. You have some tools that are tracking campaigns to the impression level. So there is a lot to be gained there. And paid media just very naturally numbers led. So I would say that is probably the type of data that I end up analyzing the most. And apart from that, product growth. Product growth is more about one-off analysis, insights, making decisions, and then repeating that. Where paid media is non-stop analysis.
Okay. I had a philosophical question, which is would you recommend a growth strategy that centers around compensating weaker areas of the business by adding paid dollars to it? Or do you favor the strategy doubling down on the areas that are successful and making sure they're capitalized on as much as possible?
Oh, I would love to hear what you think of that. I always say paid media is about pouring gasoline into the fire. So I would say it's finding out what is it about your marketing that's already working, and how can you use paid media to really enhance that. In the case of a product like growth company, how do you get paid media to really increase the virality that you already have? Or if you have content and if you're already doing like organic SEO, how do you get paid media to also scale that? That's usually my approach, but keen to hear
Yeah.
your philosophy on this though.
No, I totally agree. And it took me some time in thinking, but yeah, it makes sense. So there are not lots of different ways to be successful where you should just be propping up a lot of different areas. I think that there probably are like a couple things that your business is really good at, that it's really succeeding in, and you have to look for those things, like the key winning areas. That makes sense. Glad we agree on that.
Yeah, I say marketing is about the art of making choices, because there's just so many options in different ways that you can grow, from who to sell to, what messaging to use, what channels to leverage. And growth marketing, because it encompasses so many different parts of the business, there's even more options. And I think that's the part that data can be the most useful, is really understanding what's working, and then how to 10x that.
Yeah. So speaking of that, how do you approach building a growth marketing strategy from a high level? What are the steps you'll take to get to a strategy?
That's a very big question. I feel like we could probably be here all day talking about this. I think what parts of the strategy are even important to focus on will depend on the stage that you're at. It will depend on who your audience is, what's your LTV, and all of that. I love to start with growth models. Again, that's my data background. Putting the numbers on a sheet, understanding how the funnel moves, understanding what are the different entrance points, and then taking that as a guidance on what focus on. But again, if you're pre-product market fit, or even if you're pre-launch, then that's not really an approach that would work. So it would really depend on the stage, the channels, the audience, all these options for marketing.
Okay. And what did you mean by growth models? Could you tell us a little bit more about them?
Yeah, I'm actually also publishing an article soon about a growth model that I built for a client. So maybe by the time this podcast is published, I'll be able to link to that, explaining a bit more. But I would describe a growth model as a model. In this case, most marketers build them on a spreadsheet where you put in the different levers that lead to business revenue from your audience. So the levers would be how many users are signing up, how many website visits are you getting, how many people are converting to a trial or leads, how many leads are converting into purchases, really putting all these different metrics that go from top to bottom that impact your revenue, and then starting to connect them. The goal of a growth model is to be able to answer questions. What will happen to my MRR in 12 months if I change my conversion from trial to purchase from 10% to 12%? So the idea of a growth model is to predict the impact that different activities would have on your revenue and then be able to prioritize them. So a business can go, okay, right now we're not going to focus on decreasing churn, because if we decrease churn, the impact won't be as big as we go on to increase the number of visitors.
Okay.
Before we continue, here's a brief word from our sponsor, Alex Sofronas Marketing Services. Want to cut your marketing costs and boost your ROI? I can help. With over 10 years of experience, I use advanced testing and analytics to improve your marketing results. By understanding your audience and using targeted strategies, you'll see more efficient spend and higher returns. Ready for better results? Book a free marketing audit in the description below. And now back to the episode.
That's very interesting. So it's helping make decisions for the business to grow, breaking down the funnel.
Yes.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I say this is for all type of marketing data, marketing analytics. Everything needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Growth model is not going to give you 100% accurate prediction. The idea is, as a marketer, you can put the numbers in a model and be able to just assess which lever can I move that will have the biggest impact. So it's just about quantifying the opportunities you have and deciding what to work on. It's not just about the impact, because sometimes you can't change the lever to a certain level, right? There's only so much you can impact the KPI. So in the end, there's also the experience of the marketer towards assessing the numbers and how likely can then they be impacted.
So I'm curious, when you get your number, let's say what area to focus on, and that's going to drive the most impact. How do you go to the next step and then figure out what should happen to affect that number? What's that process look like for you?
Yeah. Now, this article will be a great link if I have it and I can add it. Because Perfect. For sure, these are some of the things that I cover in it. Usually, so first of all, you have the effect, right, of the moving the lever. So that's the first thing you've identified in the model. Second, what I usually do is I try to rate the different levers based on how probable it is for them to be moved. And this part is very a guesstimation. But the idea here is to say, okay, like churn is something that the product and the customer team has been focusing on for the past 12 months, and it hasn't changed that much. So I think we're less likely to be able to move that. Whether conversion to trial to activation is something that no one has been focused on. So I have a confidence that there's still low hanging fruits there. So you're going to take these different KPIs and you will rate based on probability. And then later on, how I like to approach it, but I think people have different methodologies. I like to brainstorm different initiatives that could then move this lever. So these initiatives can be product initiatives, it can be life cycle, things like emails or push campaigns. They can be more top of a funnel, like pay media. So I will then assess these initiatives, and then I will also rate them on complexity. So a bit like a traditional RICE model, but it's adapted to this specific growth model. And then later on, you can choose from the set of initiatives. You basically have predicted impact based on the model. You have probability of moving, the guesstimation on how much have we been trying to move this and benchmarks. And then you have the complexity, and that will be how much effort does it take to get this live. And then you can use that to shape your testing roadmap.
That's amazing. Yeah, it is really about that decision making, like you mentioned earlier. There's so much decision making and not a lot of concrete measurements, but rather a lot of assumptions about what could impact what. And I definitely know that world, and so it's a lot of exercises in reasonable and conservative expectations of what impact certain things can have. So I wanted to ask about what you mentioned about being in favor, or not in favor, I actually don't remember right now, of the single source of truth. So should there be a single source of truth for marketing analytics?
Oh, I'm very much on the no single source of truth camp. My take, as someone who works a lot with data, is that each source of truth brings a different value. Each data source assesses campaigns a bit different, has different shortcomings. So you can't, I hear sometimes, and I think a lot of this needs from one source of truth doesn't even come from marketing. I think sometimes it comes from finance, comes from operations. But this idea that marketing analytics is maths doesn't quite work, because it's not. Like all marketing metrics that we're looking at, none of them are 100%. They're all estimates, right? If you're looking at your page views on Google Analytics, that's an estimate. If you're looking at conversions on your Google Ads campaign, that's also an estimate. So each one of these estimates will bring you a different value. So if you really want to be able to assess campaigns, you have to understand that there's a reason for the discrepancies. And the solution is not to make all the discrepancies match, but to understand where the discrepancies are happening and interpret that to make decisions. That's what my take is.
So what's an example of where the discrepancies can be used to make a decision? How would you determine what the gap is?
Yeah, so I think like paid campaigns is a really good example here on what happens when you have one source of truth, right? Some companies will go, okay, we are only going to look at Google Analytics as our source of truth. So whenever we are assessing campaigns, all the paid campaigns that we're running are going to be assessed in Google Analytics. But what are the shortcomings of that? Some types of campaign are much easier to be measured on Google Analytics, right? So if you're looking at a Google search campaign where the intent is already there, it's lower in the funnel. Sometimes also about the device, right? Google search has more desktop, and people are more likely to convert within the session. And then you start looking into something like Meta, where most of the campaigns are going to be served on mobile, but maybe you're a B2B business and then most conversions happen on desktop. What you're going to see is a very low attribution on Google Analytics. And then if you're only looking at Google Analytics to make decisions, you might go as someone who's allocating budget and say, okay, we have to stop these Meta campaigns because they have a very high CPA, and we have to allocate the budget to search. but then search is not creating demand, it's only capturing demand. So you make this budget decision thinking that you're going to improve your business results, and then a lot of the times the opposite happens, because it wasn't that the meta campaigns weren't working. Maybe they weren't, but in a lot of the cases, it wasn't that they weren't working. It was that it's just a type of campaign that isn't easily measured on a tool like Google Analytics. So if you don't have, for example, server-side tracking on to calculate the correlation between spend and conversions, or zero-party data where you're asking customers where they found out about you, and you're only relying on one source that measures certain type of campaigns a lot better, you're going to make very biased decisions that are likely going to be worse for your bottom line. So that's why it's important to understand why these discrepancies happen, so you can make decisions based on the full picture, not just one source that could be benefiting a certain type of campaign.
And you mentioned server-side tracking. Can you elaborate on that?
Server-side tracking is a type of measurement that has been picking up steam in the last few years. Traditionally, conversion tracking has occurred from the client side. So it's sent from the browser when the user does a certain action. But with a lot of these privacy changes, like cookie blockers, some browser tools already blocking them automatically, consent laws where users have to consent before cookies can be stored. That means that the client side tracking is not as accurate as it used to be. So what server side tracking does, it doesn't send from the browser, so it doesn't require this cookie. It sends directly from your database to the ad platform. So for example, instead of Meta storing a cookie on your browser to understand if you have converted, the company that's advertising will then send information on yourself directly to Meta. So Meta can check, okay, was Alex served one of these ads? And then do we attribute the conversion to the campaign? So it's a relatively new way of measuring that enables ad platforms to still attribute conversions regardless of cookies.
That makes sense. And that kind of has me thinking about attribution. How do you approach attribution, specifically multiple tactics when it gets into the walled gardens and so forth, taking ownership or attribution credit for the same sales? How do you prevent that overlap?
Yeah, so I see measurements as two benefits, or tracking in general. I think part one is insights. Part one is understanding how did this campaign really perform, and what decisions should I make based on this information? And by decisions, should I spend more on this? Should I spend less? Should I spend in another campaign? And then I think part two of tracking and attribution is how can we send the best signals to the ad platform so they know who to target. I approach these things as separately. I think a lot of the times they overlap, but they're not necessarily the same. For wall gardens, if you're looking at, yeah, like Meta and Google, what I always try is to send the best quality of data signals as possible, implementing the forms of tracking that will enable the platform to really understand who is converting. So I think of things like service-side tracking, but then I also think of things like top of funnel events. What events can we send before there's been a purchase, or maybe even before there's been like a request to demo or sales for B2B, that will enable the ad platform to find the right people. And that's what I try to do on the algorithm part. On the insights part, I try to really look at results as holistically as possible. So if I'm trying to understand, should we move budget away from a certain platform, I will look into things like on econometrics. There's a lot of vendors now that have been really scaling this, but there's also a lot of open source solutions like Robin from Meta, and looking into things like surveys, asking users how did they hear about you, really trying to look at all these different sources to assess the value. So that's how I split attribution, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense, Alex.
Yeah, so it's definitely, and going along with the point about not having a single source of truth, you're making sure you're looking at it from different angles, and so there's not a big blind spot somewhere that you're not capturing. Yeah, I like the zero party data you mentioned, sending out surveys to people. Do you do that often? Have you ever done like a focus group?
Yeah, I've done a few focus groups. I've done a few user interviews. It's very funny. The first time I did the survey was from when I was working for this app. It was actually my first growth role. It was something like 10 years ago, and we had been spending a lot on influencers at the time, 10 years ago, and I couldn't see any results coming in from my attribution tools. Every signs pointed towards, wow, this thing is really not working. But I was also aware that it was YouTube and Instagram and there's no clicks and it's difficult to measure and yada yada. So then I tried something new. I prepared this type form and then I sent to new users. Yeah, tell me, how did you find out about us? And then I found out that, yeah, the influencers that I thought weren't working were bringing 30% of the new users. So ever since I've become like a big proponent of just ask users where they found out about you. If you can put into product, that's better than an email. With the moment when they're signing up, they can tick a checkbox. That is very useful. And I would also say if you're a company that's just starting with paid media, think of like attribution as like just the signaling part, like what can you send to the ad platform so they can find the right people, but ask customers where they found out about you because that will usually bring very valuable insights.
What else is good to ask customers directly besides how they found out?
Yeah, I really like to ask how they understand the product. What did you come here to solve, and how do you think we can help? Because a lot of the times there is a big dichotomy on what we think is being communicated and what the user is understanding. And it can really help shape messaging and also shape your positioning too. Because sometimes you uncover that, yeah, the biggest value that customers identify on your company isn't something that you were considering as heavily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
What do you
Yeah,
like to ask in a sales call?
I haven't been put in the position to put any questions in a sales call, but I agree that it's really important to know how the user perceives the solution to make sure that they're getting the most value out of it. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. And it's something that it's very easy to misunderstand.
yeah, perception, the audience perception of the product. Let's see. So, in terms of how you measure success, a lot of people focus on revenue. You mentioned monthly recurring revenue earlier. What are some KPIs that you measure to track a business's success of their marketing strategies?
I'm a big fan of not many KPIs. I am also a big fan of tracking the least amount that's necessary. I think most of insights don't lie in more KPIs, but they lie in increased segmentation. I always want to track three things for the campaigns that I have. I want to track reach. I want to understand how many eyeballs are being reached. How far is this campaign going? I like to understand engagement, conversions. So that will be, for example, yeah, how many people are downloading a lead asset? How many people are registering for an event? How many people are starting a trial, starting a free account? And then I like to track value. So value would be ROAS, would be like LTV. And then I think once you have these three things down, don't worry too much about tracking. Start worrying more about how can you segment these numbers. How can you segment these numbers based on what channel they came from? How can you segment these numbers based on what messaging you use to attract them, what creative they saw, what market they came from. I think after you have these three things down, then it becomes about, yeah, really understanding how they differ per, again, all these different options of marketing.
Yeah, and are you looking at different audiences as well that are coming to this site and converting?
Yeah, yeah, you can look at different audiences in plenty of different ways. In the case of paid media, you can look into just the audiences that you're targeting. If you're using something like a data enrichment tool, like a Clearbit, you can also segment these values per firmographics. Audiences are very important. So you should always try to segment as per different audiences.
Mm-hmm.
I often think of the superhuman methodology for measuring product market fit, where they kept emailing users and asking how disappointed would they be if superhuman stopped existing. And then that's what they used to find the people that cared about the product the most. They took the I will be very disappointed users and they identified what were the similarities among them. And then they went towards getting more of these people. That kind of approach you can take for multiple types of marketing activities. If you're running search, for example, there's going to be a big difference between the user behavior depending on the different keywords that you're targeting. Some keywords, you're going to find the users that would be very disappointed. And then you should start looking at those keywords and find, okay, people that are searching for this, what else are they doing? How else can I reach them?
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. That's different than what I thought before. But I guess those would be the best customers, the ones that would be most disappointed by not
Yeah.
having the service.
And then it comes back to pouring gasoline into the fire. When you already, if you define, okay, these are the customers that value us a lot, it's a lot easier to figure out, yeah, how do we get just more of these people? That's what I think marketing can be the most effective in. It's a lot easier to do that than to go on and convince other type of users to buy a product.
Do you ever look for partnerships to cross sell with other companies? Is that in the scope of your role?
What do you mean partnerships?
So sometimes the companies will team up and offer perks to another company in exchange for getting in front of their audience. And I feel like this partnerships model is becoming more of a thing in marketing as like a substitute for putting as many media dollars into market.
Yeah. It's not something that's within my scope, but as someone that does a lot of projects for data products, it's something that's very similar in that industry. Because sometimes you've saw that a lot with the growth of the modern data stack, with companies like Snowflake and DBT coming up. When a company is in this modernization journey, where they are upgrading their data stack, they're not searching for one tool, they're searching for many tools at the same time. When these companies partner, it makes it a lot easier for them because a customer that wants to use DBT also wants to use Snowflake and then also wants to use Fivetran. And then there's all these tools that really plug together very well. So I think that partnership for like a holistic stack, you saw it very well around this time within the modern data stack.
Yeah. It's the businesses thinking about what the customer wants holistically. What are the different services that they use and bundling that together for them to win for all the businesses.
Yeah, there are these purchase journeys that companies will go through where one thing unlocks many next steps, right? So we did this positioning for a mobile growth agency. And then we found out that a lot of the times more traditional companies would hire people from tech to grow their digital products, and then they will be searching for a new product analytics tool, they would be searching for a new CRM. So the change that would happen in the company would then unleash all these other needs that they would have. So if the growth agency was also partnering with a product analytics tool, then they can sell their services together and then they can be implementation partners and all of that. So there are certain cases, I think, at least you see it a lot in B2B because that's where a lot of my experience comes in. But I think for B2C, you can, yeah, extrapolate to something. When you buy a house, like you're going to be buying so many different things, right? You're going to be getting new services, new bills, new TV, new sofa. That's why these in-market segments are so used to in pay media, like having a child, getting a mortgage, because then it unleashes all these different things you have to also get at the same time. And with B2B, you also see that too.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, what would you say are some misconceptions about growth marketing?
I think I hate this whole growth hacking term. I'm glad that it's dying out, although, yeah, a slower death than I hoped for. I think this idea that you can hack sustainable growth is just not how it works. The short term thinking also can be very harmful. I think also this idea that you should just iterate. I don't think that's what growth marketing is, but I think a lot of people think it's about just iteration. And I think, I don't know. What do you think, Alex? I feel like you're going to have a better answer than me.
Growth, I guess it depends on who it's in the eyes of. So I guess in the eyes of the business is going to see growth marketing as a lever to gain more sales. I guess the misconception would be in the scope or like the control that the growth marketers actually have, because anything is going to require a lot of collaboration and cooperation across the business and a lot of data. So I think it's like the fact that it's more of an advisory role rather than, and it requires a lot of cooperation within the business rather than being its own team that can execute everything needed for that growth, because there's just so many people that are involved in making any changes. So it's almost like a consultative team rather than it's like its own growth. Like it doesn't actually generate the growth. Like the things that need to be changed and that need to happen happens outside of the team. They're this like the strategy component of that growth. That might, I think
Yeah.
that's probably a misconception.
Yeah, so you think maybe like over reliance, believing one person can or one team can change the growth trajectory, that's not feasible.
Yeah, it's a big name for what it's doing. It does sound great, but it's a tough thing to put into one team. I think it does work. It's just that they're the strategic side, and then you need a strong execution side to make sure those strategies work. But I definitely think it's a smart idea to have a growth team that is focused on that, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to look out for themselves. Each tactic that's managed is going to try to optimize itself, but they're not thinking holistically across
Yeah.
all of the tactics. How can the company
Yeah.
overall grow the most?
Yeah. I don't have such a definite take if having a growth team is necessary, or if sometimes I feel just having a growth mentality in the business can be enough. I think the most important thing for the success of a business is that everyone is thinking about growth. And I think what you say sometimes I've been in projects where a client thought that, yeah, you just put a growth team and then it will grow. But if the other parts of product is not thinking about growth, if engineering is not thinking about growth, if design is not thinking about growth, then it's very difficult to get growth.
Exactly. Yeah, it requires everybody to be rowing in the same direction. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's where you get into
Yeah.
strategy. And I think it benefits businesses large and small. I think it's probably easier to grow a small business depending on the stage that the business is in. So like I have
Hmm.
particular experience with very big companies that have been around for a long time and have a lot of competitors. So that's a very
Hmm.
different business. That's maybe a little bit harder to grow than a startup that's growing rapidly already and gaining adoption. And so the strategies are going to be a little bit different, but I definitely see the value of focusing on it as an
Yeah,
enterprise.
yeah. And I think the most valuable asset a lot of the times the growth team can bring is helping with prioritization, is helping with quantifying, like we were talking earlier about the model. So it's quantifying the different parts of the business and then helping the business make the right decisions on what to focus on.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier lifetime value. A lot of businesses, there's like a struggle between number of sales and then value of sales. And depending on where the business is, they might want one versus the other. Where do you, and then you have like return on marketing investment, which is combination of those. What is the best, or how do you approach deciding what the best overall measure is for, is it return on marketing investment all the time? Are there times when you should see a different metric as ideal, or is it always return on marketing investment? How do you approach what the ideal measurement is for value creation within marketing?
It's a great question. I think a lot of the times it depends on the length of the funnel. Some businesses have really low churn, right? Just by default. Say change your CRM system. That takes a year to set it up. And then it will take even longer to get everyone using it. So it's a very long LTV. And in that case, if you're only looking at ROAS, then you could be taking you 5 years to recoup that investment from the campaigns. And does that make sense for a business? So I think a lot of the times when you do have the LTV that's split across many years, looking at things like payback periods can be really valuable. I have a client right now and we're just setting up some new ways of measuring and assessing the paid campaigns to understand budget allocation. And what we're using is the percentage of the investments that's recouped in under a quarter. So picking the strategies that recoup the biggest percentage, sometimes after 3 months, they're already profitable with this company. A lot of the strategies are already profitable. So picking these strategies to allocate more budget to is what we're doing. But I think for e-commerce, which I don't have a lot of experience, I think that's quite different. But yeah, I think that the variables that will impact this will be the length of the funnel, payback periods, and LTV.
That makes sense. Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the payback period because that can completely change the way that the marketing is built, that the marketing funnel is built, because there's going to be certain audiences that may provide more value in the short term, but less value in the long term. And depending on the way the business prefers the revenue to come in, that can determine which customers you're going after. It's interesting, and that's something I haven't thought about a lot yet, like which one is better for a customer that pays more upfront and less in the long term versus one that pays less upfront but more in the long term. I'm not sure which one. I guess whichever one's net larger, but yeah, a lot of businesses want that upfront return. They don't want to wait a really long time.
And sometimes there is like other business decisions associated with it. Maybe you are historically a bottoms up SaaS, but then you're starting to move up market. That's where you see the biggest opportunities. You see there's more competitors entering your space to, let's say, serve SMBs, and then you want to start focusing on bigger companies and enterprises. And that will have a very different sales funnel and have a very different LTV. It can be a decision on the business to approach that, or also the other way around. There's maybe you're struggling to sell it to enterprises, you're starting to see tractions on SMBs. So in order to scale that, you want to acquire more of those type of customers. So then create a network effect that maybe on the long term will mean that you're going to have a longer ROAS. Yeah, I think with marketing, it's hard to find a one size fits all.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that there's just the concept of audiences and that people behave similarly, and you can go out and find other people that behave similarly. I guess speaking on that point, when you're looking at data that can be used to target people, do you prefer demographic versus behavioral data? Is there a particular kind of data that you prefer when you're going out to find new audiences?
I guess that will also depend on the type of business. Usually, I don't rely a lot on demographic data because that's I do a lot of work for B2B. So I think in that case, the decisions will maybe be like related on, yeah, how what does the stack that this company has looks like, or what kind of personnel do they have, and what's the level of technical maturity, or who are they selling to. So it won't be necessarily demographic information in this case. And I think behavioral data, it's a lot of the times it's useful for understanding the whys. They're using this feature because they want to achieve this. So it's often a connection of maybe behavioral with firmographic is what I'd say I rely the most on.
Yeah, behavioral data is like a luxury that we have now that we didn't always have, and so it started with demographic, and it's
Yeah.
evolved.
And behavior data can often also be quite difficult to interpret because, yeah, correlation does not mean causation, right? Sometimes you think this feature is used because they want to do this, but then it turns out that it's used just because it's in the onboarding in a certain way. So it's important to really run like a hypothesis based test if you want to rely on that to make
Okay.
decisions. Qualitative, talking to people is always a big fan of that.
Yeah. Do you set up a lot of tests in the growth function to identify areas where there's potential for growth, or is it a lot of retrospective analysis?
No, I do a lot of tests. A lot of tests is what I rely on. I think when you're looking through historical data, it's expression in English, like needle in the haystack. And then you can something there, but then you never know if it's there's actual or if it's not correlation. So I would say you search for something historically, maybe you come up with a hypothesis, but then later on you have to set up the hypothesis as a test. And then that's how you really prove or disprove.
That makes sense. I was curious, as you see growth marketing as an industry evolving, what do you think some of the changes will be in the next few years to how growth marketing runs?
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of changes. I think there's at least two big things happening right now. You have the growth of AI, and then you also have the growth of privacy features and privacy legislation. So, on one hand, it's going to become a lot more difficult to measure and to understand, but there also be an increase on velocity on what can be produced. And I think in the case of something like paid media that I do a lot of work with, you see a lot of these AI strategies being launched by Google, the shopping strategies, Performance Max, where it uses a lot of ML signals to identify the audience, but then the strategy is like super black box. So as an analyst, it's very difficult to understand why it's working. So I think for growth marketing, we're going to have to be a lot more creative to find ways of measurement. And there's going to be more investment on research so we can get the right numbers.
You mentioned Performance Max. I've heard it called PMax.
Yeah.
I feel like marketers don't like black boxes when it comes to what's going on and what's generating the positive effects. Do you agree with that? What's your opinion on PMax?
I don't know. Like, I've heard a lot from advertisers, like, they've been successful with it. I do not like black boxes. I think a lot of the role of paid media is to understand what's working and why it's working and take those insights to other marketing strategies. I have been with projects with clients where we have run holdout tests of PMAX, to calculate the incrementality. And we saw very little incrementality. I think a lot of people that are spending on PMax are just reaching the users that would have converted anyway. But yeah, of course, that Google and Co have gotten better at identifying the users that will convert. So on paper, they should be able to get results from the technology for this. But I think the incentives for the app platforms is to show conversions, and it's not to show incremental conversions. So I think where the biggest risk lies for marketers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to ask about if you're an entrepreneur with a limited set of resources to grow your customer base, and let's say you're in a B2B business, what's the tactic and that you would pick as the best leverage tactic, and what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I think you have to test. You have to approach new channels as tests. You have to be skeptical of results. Talk to the customers. Find out where did they hear about you. Find out what criteria they're using to decide the tools. And I would say for any businesses, reach your users where they're at. I think for B2B, if there's already an intent present, search can be a great channel. If there isn't an intent, LinkedIn has great targeting capabilities. There is a lot of, and but that's not something that I'm much of a specialist on, but there is a lot of these new, sales AI tools that do a great job, like creating lists of who potential customers are and reaching them. But you have to test. And when you
Yeah,
find something that works, you should scale that,
I
squeeze.
love it. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to let them know that you have a newsletter, and I'll put a link to the newsletter in the description of this episode. Do you have any recent newsletters you've put out? Anything that you'd like to share that you found particularly exciting?
Yeah, I think for this conversation that we've had just now, I would say if you're visiting the newsletter, there's two articles that could be interesting to read. One of them is on data discrepancies, so explaining a bit why different platforms report conversions differently. I think that's very helpful to understand why something like a one source of truth can be harmful. I've got this other article too that is on different ways of measurement. So talking about the difference between using something like in click-based attribution, I think that can be also like very insightful to to understand what's the pros and the cons and what's important to have these different points of views for your marketing. And hopefully the piece on the growth model is published by then. And then I can also mention that one that talks about for a specific client of mine how I built a growth model for them and how that helped product and marketing work better together.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. And I want to thank you, Barbara, for sharing all of this. This has been such a great episode.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex, for having me. I've been trying to do more of these. Happy to flex the talking muscle here, and hopefully I will improve and be helpful to others.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.